The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden hue over the city streets. People hurried about, lost in their daily routines, paying little attention to the details of the world around them. Among them, a homeless man sat on the corner of a busy street, his back against the brick wall of a small, rundown building. His name was Marcus, and to the casual observer, he was just another face in the crowd, a man forgotten by society. His clothes were torn, his face unshaven, and his eyes distant, haunted by memories no one could understand. Most people avoided eye contact with him. They glanced at him only briefly, if at all, before quickly looking away. Homeless people were often invisible to those who walked by, their suffering unnoticed in the whirlwind of city life. No one knew Marcus's story. No one knew the man he used to be. Marcus had seen it all. He had fought in wars, survived battles that would break anyone, and lived through experiences that had forever changed him. Once, he had been a highly trained Green Beret sniper, a legend in his own right. He had served his country with honor, earning respect for his skill and precision. But that was a lifetime ago. Now he lived on the streets, forgotten by everyone, except for the occasional passerby who might drop some spare change in his cup. It was on this particular afternoon that everything changed. Two police officers, Officer Riley and Officer Parker, strolled down the street, chatting as they made their rounds. They had seen Marcus countless times before, sitting on the same corner day after day. They knew he was harmless, just another part of the urban landscape, someone who had fallen through the cracks. But that didn't stop them from passing judgment on him. They saw him as just another homeless man, someone who needed to be moved along. And that day, they decided to confront him. Officer Riley, the younger of the two, nudged his partner. "Let's see if he's still here," he said, nodding toward Marcus. "We should move him along before he causes any problems." Officer Parker, older and more experienced, glanced at Marcus from a distance. "Yeah, let's check on him. Maybe give him a warning." They made their way toward Marcus, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Marcus didn't look up. He was used to people walking past him, ignoring him, pretending he didn't exist. But as the officers approached, something in the air shifted. He could feel their eyes on him, their judgment in the way they walked. "Hey," Officer Riley called out as they reached him, standing tall over Marcus. "You can't just sit here all day, man. Move along." Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply looked up at the officers, his eyes tired but focused. He had dealt with this before, police officers telling him to leave, to get off the streets. It was a routine. But this time, something felt different. There was a slight tension in the air, an unease that made Marcus sit up straighter. "Do you have any ID?" Officer Parker asked, his tone firm. "You're not supposed to be here without a permit." Marcus slowly stood up, his movements calm and controlled. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't interested in arguing either. He knew better than to challenge an officer on the streets, especially when they were so quick to make assumptions. "I'm just passing through," Marcus said quietly, his voice deep but steady. "I'm not causing any harm." But the officers weren't satisfied. Officer Riley took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Marcus more carefully. "You're just a bum, aren't you? Probably nothing more than a troublemaker." His words were cold, dismissive. Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard worse in his life, but something about Riley's words struck a nerve. His eyes momentarily flickered, a flicker of something dangerous in them that the officer didn't catch. No one ever saw it coming, not until it was too late. For a moment, Marcus's past flashed before his eyes. The countless hours spent training, the long nights in the woods, the targets he'd taken down from miles away, with deadly precision. The skills he had were not those of a simple homeless man. They were the skills of a Green Beret sniper. But that part of him was buried deep, locked away from the world. No one needed to know. But today, things were different. Today, the world was about to learn who Marcus really was. Officer Parker, sensing that Marcus wasn't going to comply, took another step forward. You know, we could arrest you for loitering. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." Marcus took a slow, deep breath. He could feel the tension building in his chest. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with, but he didn't want to fight. Not today. Not unless it was absolutely necessary. "Just leave me be," Marcus said again, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not hurting anyone." But Officer Riley wasn't done. He took a step closer, now standing directly in front of Marcus. He smirked. "You think you can just sit here and do nothing? Get out of here, or we'll have to do something about it." At that moment, something in Marcus snapped. The memories of the battlefield, the training he had undergone, all of it came rushing back. He was no longer just the homeless man on the street. He was a Green Beret sniper, one of the most lethal soldiers in history. His mind raced, calculating the best way to handle the situation without causing harm. But before he could make his move, something unexpected happened. The officer's radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension. The sound was like a sharp slap to the face, bringing both officers back to reality. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. Marcus stood there, silent but watchful, knowing that the story was just beginning. As the officers stood frozen for a brief moment, the crackling radio in Officer Riley's hand cut through the tension like a blade. His grip tightened around the device as the dispatcher's voice echoed in his ear. "Unit 34, we have a situation developing on 5th and Main. A robbery in progress. Possible suspect in a black SUV. Over." The words were enough to pull both officers out of their stance. Officer Riley quickly glanced at his partner. The unease that had settled in his chest from the confrontation with Marcus now turned into a sense of urgency. There were bigger problems to deal with, and he knew it. The situation with Marcus, the homeless man sitting so still, would have to wait. Without another word, Officer Riley snapped the radio back into place on his belt. "We've got to go," he said, his voice sharp, his thoughts already on the robbery. But Marcus was still standing there, unmoved, his dark eyes following the officer's every move. He had heard the radio too. He knew what that call meant. As the officers turned to walk away, Marcus' instincts kicked in. His years of training, his heightened awareness, told him the situation wasn't just a random robbery. Something about it felt off, like a setup. Maybe it was the way the dispatcher had spoken, maybe the timing. It didn't matter. "Are you sure you're going to let that go?" Marcus spoke quietly, his voice steady, but his words had a weight to them that caught Officer Parker off guard. The officers paused. Officer Riley turned back, eyeing the homeless man. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice filled with annoyance, but also curiosity. "You just got a robbery call, right?" Marcus continued, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the rising tension in the air. "What if it's a trap? What if the robbery is just a distraction for something bigger?" The officers exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Marcus, with his sharp words and surprising insight, seemed to be suggesting something the officers hadn't even considered. "You're a homeless man," Officer Riley scoffed, shaking his head. "Why are you even talking about this? It's none of your business." But Marcus didn't back down. He had learned long ago that the streets could be more dangerous than any battlefield. He had seen how easily people could be used as pawns in a bigger game. The robbery was just the surface, a piece of something much larger, and Marcus wasn't going to let it slip by unnoticed. "I know what I'm talking about," Marcus replied, his voice low and calm, but there was a fire in his eyes now. "It's not just a robbery. Someone's setting something up. I don't know who, but they're not thinking this through." The officers stared at him for a moment. The sudden insight from a homeless man seemed strange to them, but something about Marcus's gaze made them hesitate. For the briefest second, they both realized they were not dealing with an ordinary man. But duty called. Officer Riley, his patience running thin, stepped forward. "Listen, you don't need to get involved in this. If you know what's good for you, you'll stay out of our way. We have a job to do." Before Marcus could respond, the officers turned their backs to him and started walking toward their patrol car. The weight of their words hung in the air. But Marcus, his mind always calculating, didn't move. His instincts screamed that they were walking into something dangerous. He waited. And then, as if something in him just snapped, he made his decision. Without thinking twice, he strode down the street in the opposite direction from the officers. He was moving fast, his long legs eating up the pavement. He wasn't about to let this go. There was a reason he had been trained, why he had been one of the best in the military. He had an eye for danger. And today, the danger was on the streets. He couldn't sit back and watch it unfold. The black SUV sat quietly in front of an old, abandoned building. The city around it was bustling, yet the car's stillness felt unnerving, like a trap waiting to spring. Officer Riley narrowed his eyes as he steered the patrol car slowly past the vehicle, keeping a cautious distance. "Something doesn't feel right," Officer Riley muttered under his breath. He turned to his partner, Officer Parker, but Parker's focus was on the building ahead. The two officers had been trained to notice the little things. The way the SUV was parked too perfectly. The silence surrounding it. There was no movement inside. No one casually strolling past the vehicle. No pedestrians going about their business. "Let's check it out," Officer Riley decided, slowing the car to a stop several yards away. Both officers unbuckled their seatbelts and readied themselves to exit. Riley pulled his flashlight from his belt, while Parker checked his weapon. Marcus, meanwhile, was watching from a distance. He had followed the officers, staying in the shadows, moving with quiet precision. He had no plan to get involved with the cops directly. But his gut told him that this wasn't just any robbery. Something much darker was unfolding, and he couldn't let them walk into it alone. As the officers approached the building cautiously, Marcus stayed in the background, watching closely. He knew this place well. It was a spot where the city's underbelly often gathered. Drug deals, shady meetings, and sometimes, worse. He had been here once or twice during his time on the streets, but back then, he had a different mission, one that didn't involve law enforcement. Now, it was different. The city felt darker, more dangerous than it had in years. Something told Marcus that the robbery call was a cover for something bigger. It was always the small details that gave it away. The setup. As Riley and Parker approached the building's entrance, they noticed two figures standing in the dim light near the entrance. They were talking, their voices low and indistinct, but Riley could see the distinct outlines of guns strapped to their sides. He motioned to Parker to stay alert. "This isn't looking like a regular robbery," Officer Riley whispered, his hand resting on the butt of his firearm. Suddenly, a figure in a black hoodie stepped out from behind the corner of the building, holding a large duffel bag. The bag was too big, too heavy-looking to just contain stolen goods. It wasn't a normal robbery setup. Riley's heart rate picked up as the figure took a step forward. "Stop right there," Officer Riley ordered, his voice firm and commanding. The figure didn't move. Instead, he turned slightly to face the officers. Riley's eyes narrowed as he saw the outline of a weapon in the man's hands. "Get on the ground. Now," Officer Riley shouted, taking a step closer. But just as he was about to approach, the figure in the hoodie raised the bag higher. And that's when everything changed. Without warning, the figure hurled the bag in their direction with deadly precision. Riley and Parker barely had time to react. It was a diversion, one that would buy the man enough time to make his escape. The bag hit the ground with a loud crash, but it wasn't what Riley and Parker were focused on. It was the sharp sound of tires screeching against asphalt. The black SUV. It was moving fast, suddenly darting towards the officers, accelerating as if it had been waiting for the right moment. "Move," Officer Parker yelled, pulling Riley to the side, narrowly avoiding being hit by the speeding vehicle. Before either officer could fully react, the SUV skidded to a halt just feet away from them. The door opened, and two more armed men leaped out, their faces masked. The situation was no longer just a robbery. It was a well-planned ambush. Marcus had seen enough. He was already moving, closing the distance between himself and the unfolding chaos. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the alley as one of the masked men aimed his weapon at the officers, and Marcus knew exactly what to do. He had spent years in situations like this, facing deadly threats and acting without hesitation. Without a second thought, Marcus made his move, darting behind the corner of the building. He wasn't just a man on the streets anymore. He was a soldier, a Green Beret sniper. And he wasn't about to let the officers die in this trap. The moment he rounded the corner, Marcus reached into the small backpack he carried with him, a bag that had been carefully packed over the years with equipment he never thought he'd use again. But today was different. Today, his training was more than just a memory. It was a lifeline. He pulled out a set of binoculars, quickly scanning the scene. His fingers moved with swift precision as he adjusted the scope on his hidden weapon, an old but reliable sniper rifle. From this angle, Marcus could see everything. The two masked gunmen, the car, the officers caught in the open. Everything. He calculated the distance, the wind, and the trajectory in an instant. And then, with the calm and deadly focus that had been drilled into him for years, Marcus took aim. As the chaos unfolded in front of him, Marcus didn't flinch. He had been in countless high-pressure situations before, and this one was no different. The gunmen were moving quickly, their focus on the two officers who were now trying to get behind the cover of a nearby dumpster. The SUV was parked at an odd angle, likely to shield their escape. From his hidden position, Marcus adjusted his sniper rifle once again, taking another steady breath. His training took over. He had been trained to deal with situations like this, situations where quick thinking and deadly precision meant the difference between life and death. Through the lens of the scope, Marcus watched as one of the gunmen aimed his weapon at Officer Riley. Riley had been slow to react, too focused on the figure with the duffel bag. The gunman was just a few yards away, lining up a shot. Marcus' finger tightened on the trigger. In one smooth motion, Marcus squeezed the trigger, the sound of the gunshot, a quiet whisper compared to the chaos around him. The first gunman dropped to the ground instantly, a clean shot through the shoulder. He wasn't dead, but he was out of commission. His weapon clattered to the ground as he crumpled in a heap. The remaining gunman spun around, looking for the source of the shot. His eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of Marcus. But the Green Beret sniper had already moved, shifting his position in the shadows, becoming one with the dark city streets. "Riley, get down," Officer Parker shouted as he pulled Riley to the ground behind the dumpster. Both officers scrambled, their adrenaline pumping as they tried to gain control of the situation. They had no idea where the shot had come from, but they were grateful for the help. They had barely avoided being shot themselves. Meanwhile, the remaining gunman, panic now setting in, raised his weapon, moving toward the officer's position. He was desperate now, thinking only about survival. He didn't care about the ambush anymore. All that mattered was getting out. But Marcus wasn't finished. He saw the gunman trying to make his way toward Riley and Parker, using the SUV for cover. His movements were sloppy, rushing. Marcus had him in his sights again. Without hesitation, Marcus fired another shot. This one hit the gunman's leg, dropping him instantly. The man screamed in pain, falling to the ground. His weapon skidded across the pavement, far out of reach. The two officers, now realizing that the immediate threat had been neutralized, slowly rose from their cover. They looked around, still unsure of where the shots had come from. The silence in the air was almost deafening. Marcus, hidden in the shadows, allowed himself a moment to breathe. His heart rate was steady, his thoughts sharp. He knew that the danger wasn't over yet. There were more unknowns in this equation, and Marcus wasn't about to let his guard down just because a few men had been taken out. The officers, finally regaining their bearings, approached the downed gunman carefully, weapons drawn. Riley moved toward the first man he had shot, checking his condition. He was breathing but unconscious. The second man, who had been shot in the leg, was writhing in pain, trying to crawl toward his weapon. "Don't move," Officer Riley shouted, pointing his weapon at the man. He glanced back at his partner. "Call for backup. Now." Officer Parker quickly pulled out his radio, his hand shaking slightly as he tried to maintain control of the situation. But he knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The unexpected ally. But as the officers focused on securing the gunman, something caught Riley's eye. It was a faint movement on the rooftops. Marcus was watching them from above, but Riley hadn't seen him. The sniper was now calculating his next move, whether to stay hidden or intervene more directly. For a moment, the officers were left with nothing more than the sound of the distant sirens approaching. But Riley knew that the moment they arrested these men, their troubles would only just begin. Someone had orchestrated this attack, someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and the idea that a homeless man had just saved their lives was still rattling Riley's brain. As the backup arrived, the officers began to secure the scene. Marcus, his mission complete, disappeared back into the shadows. He knew that his job wasn't finished. Whoever was behind this ambush was still out there, and they would soon learn that the streets weren't as empty as they thought. And so, as the police worked to piece together the clues, Marcus slipped quietly into the night, ready for whatever came next. The calm that had settled over the street was deceiving. With the sound of approaching sirens and the officers now securing the area, one might think that the immediate threat had passed. But Marcus knew better. In the world he came from, threats never disappeared that easily. They only evolved. As Riley and Parker worked to handcuff the injured gunman, more units arrived. The scene quickly became crowded with officers, paramedics, and detectives who began to piece together what had happened. Yet, despite the flurry of activity, one thing was painfully clear. No one had any idea who was behind the attack. Riley stood by his car, watching as the officers secured the scene. His mind was still spinning. He couldn't shake the image of the homeless man who had helped them. Marcus. It wasn't just the fact that he'd saved their lives that disturbed Riley. It was the way he had moved, the way he had reacted. Everything about Marcus suggested that he wasn't just another street dweller. He had the calm and control of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than the officers ever had. But how could that be? Riley couldn't fathom the answer. His partner, Officer Parker, approached him, his face grim. "You think that guy, Marcus, is involved in this somehow?" Parker asked, glancing back at the scene. Riley hesitated. He didn't know what to believe. But the way Marcus had handled the situation, without hesitation, without fear, had left an impression. "I don't know," Riley said quietly, "but something's off. We need to find out who he really is." The chase begins. Marcus, meanwhile, had already disappeared back into the city. He moved through the streets with practiced ease, knowing that the officers were likely going to look for him, to question him. But he wasn't ready to be found just yet. Not until he understood who was behind the ambush. As he walked, his mind raced. The gunmen had been too organized. Their moves had been too calculated. This wasn't a random robbery gone wrong. This had been a targeted hit. Someone had planned it carefully. And that meant someone with resources, someone with power. But Marcus wasn't just any man on the street. He had been a Green Beret, trained for situations like this. He had spent years operating in the shadows, learning how to track people, how to blend in, how to stay one step ahead. He wasn't going to let whoever was behind this get away with it. Not without paying the price. Marcus stopped at a corner, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. He flipped through it, finding a name written at the top of the page: Charles Bradford. The name of a man Marcus had been hunting for years. Charles Bradford was the link. The man who had crossed Marcus's path during a covert mission gone awry. Bradford was the reason Marcus had ended up on the streets, stripped of everything he had once been. But Marcus had never forgotten. Bradford was part of a larger network, a shadow organization operating in the dark corners of the world. His reach was long, and his resources were endless. But Marcus knew that if Bradford was behind this, he was going to regret crossing paths with the wrong man. Marcus put the notebook back into his jacket pocket and glanced over his shoulder. He was being followed. He could feel it. A black SUV was moving slowly down the street, not too far behind him. It wasn't the same vehicle from earlier, but Marcus knew better than to assume it was just a coincidence. He sped up, weaving through alleys and side streets, keeping an eye on the SUV through the corner of his vision. The men inside weren't trying to be discreet. They were following him openly, clearly thinking he hadn't noticed. But Marcus had been trained for this. He knew exactly how to lose them. The unseen threat, back at the scene. Riley and Parker had finished questioning the gunman and were starting to get a clearer picture. The two men who had been arrested were part of a larger group, but they still didn't have a full understanding of who was behind the operation. The robbery was just the surface. The deeper they dug, the more questions arose. Detectives were now poring over the duffel bag left behind by the gunman. Inside, they found various tools, high-tech surveillance equipment, maps, and encrypted documents. This was no ordinary robbery. This was a well-orchestrated operation. Someone had planned this down to the last detail. Riley stood beside the bag, his mind still reeling from the events. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play. And as he scanned the crime scene once more, he realized something unsettling. Marcus had been right. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a diversion, and they had only scratched the surface. The officers were still unaware of Marcus's involvement. They had no idea who he truly was or what he had been through. But they were beginning to understand that the situation was far from over. And as the police worked to gather information, Marcus, hidden in the shadows, continued his hunt. His mission had just begun. There was a storm on the horizon, and he would not rest until he had faced it head-on. As the night deepened, Marcus moved silently through the city, his eyes constantly scanning for any signs of danger. The black SUV that had been tailing him earlier had disappeared, but that didn't mean he was safe. Marcus had been in too many life-or-death situations to let his guard down now. The stakes were too high. The streetlights cast long shadows, but Marcus thrived in the darkness. He'd spent years operating behind enemy lines, using the cover of night to his advantage. He blended in with the city's underbelly, familiar yet invisible. Tonight, however, felt different. The air was tense, like the calm before a storm. He made his way toward an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place he knew well. It had been a long time since he had stepped foot inside, but it was the perfect place to lay low while he worked out his next move. The warehouse had once been used by his old Green Beret team for training, and he had a feeling it might offer some answers to the mystery at hand. As Marcus approached the entrance, he stopped in his tracks. His keen instincts told him something was off. There were no sounds, no usual scurrying of rats or the distant hum of the city's traffic. The place felt too quiet, too still. He slipped into the shadows, positioning himself near the entrance. He wasn't alone. His pulse quickened, but he remained calm. A car had just pulled up outside the warehouse, and two men stepped out. They were wearing suits, clean, professional, and definitely not the type who would typically frequent a place like this. Marcus squinted, trying to make out their faces. There was something familiar about them. Then it hit him. They were part of the same group that had tried to kill him years ago. The same men who had been involved in his downfall. These were the people he'd been hunting ever since he'd been forced to leave the life he once knew. They were tied to Charles Bradford, the man who had destroyed everything Marcus had built. But now, Marcus wasn't just a soldier. He was a man on a mission, seeking vengeance and justice. He crouched lower, taking steady breaths as the two men moved toward the building. His mind raced. He could end this here. He could take them out in an instant. They were unarmed, unsuspecting. But Marcus knew that this was bigger than just a personal vendetta. There were more people involved, and he needed to learn more before making his move. With the sharpness that came from years of training, Marcus crept closer to the warehouse, moving silently along the side of the building until he reached an old window. He crouched low, peering inside. The two men were speaking with someone, a third person, sitting at a table in the middle of the room. The conversation was quiet, but Marcus could hear a few words drift through the cracked window. "Bradford wants results, or we're out." "You know what that means," one of the men said. Marcus's blood ran cold. Bradford. The name sent a wave of fury through him, but he stayed focused. This was the break he needed. He had to get closer. The reveal. Inside the warehouse, the conversation continued. The man sitting at the table had a cold, calculating look on his face, someone who didn't care for anything other than power and control. Marcus's instincts told him that this man was someone important, someone who held the key to everything. "Marcus is still out there," the man said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet menace. "We have to make sure he doesn't interfere again." Marcus's grip tightened on the frame of the window as he listened. They were talking about him. They knew he was still alive. But what did they want with him now? It was clear that they had no idea that he had been the one to take out the gunman earlier. He needed answers. Suddenly, the door to the warehouse creaked open, and Marcus quickly moved to the side. He didn't want to be caught eavesdropping, but he wasn't about to leave now. He had come too far. The voices grew louder as the men inside moved toward the exit. Marcus took a deep breath, preparing for what was next. Just as the men stepped outside, Marcus ducked into the shadows, out of sight. They were getting into their cars, one of them in a sleek black sedan, the other in a dark SUV. Marcus moved swiftly, keeping his distance as they drove off. He followed them for several blocks, his mind piecing together what he had overheard. They were on their way to meet someone who had the power to destroy him once and for all, or perhaps someone who could help him get the answers he needed. The chase. Marcus's training kicked in as he closed the gap between himself and the cars. His heart rate remained steady. He wasn't going to lose them now. They were getting closer to the outskirts of the city, where it was quieter, more isolated. He couldn't afford to be discovered. His only chance was to follow them long enough to gather intel, to see where they were going, and to learn what their plans were. The roads became winding, leading into the countryside. Marcus knew he couldn't afford to be reckless. One mistake could blow his cover, and everything would be lost. He had been in situations like this before, following a target in the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike. The element of surprise was everything, and Marcus intended to use it to his advantage. As the men's vehicles slowed down near an old farmhouse, Marcus came to a stop a few hundred yards away. He ducked behind some trees, watching intently. The farmhouse appeared abandoned, but something about it felt off. He couldn't explain it, but his gut told him this was no coincidence. This was where he would find the answers. Marcus crouched in the shadows, his breathing steady and controlled. He knew this could be the moment that determined everything. The end of the line, or the beginning of a new chapter in his relentless pursuit of justice. As the black sedan and SUV parked near the old farmhouse, Marcus surveyed the area carefully. The lights from the farmhouse were dim, but there were figures moving inside. It wasn't a large group, just a few men, but they were definitely up to something. The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus had been tracking these men for too long. He knew that behind their cool, calculating exteriors, they were dangerous. The type of men who would destroy anyone who got in their way. But Marcus wasn't just anyone. He was a Green Beret, a sniper, trained to survive and take down threats without hesitation. He had nothing left to lose. The farmhouse was old, the wooden planks weathered from years of neglect. It looked abandoned, but Marcus knew better. The men inside had probably fortified it, turning it into a base of operations for something bigger. The meeting was likely taking place in the back room, where the leader, who Marcus suspected was Charles Bradford, was laying out his next move. Marcus had to get in there, and he had to do it fast. He watched as the men stepped out of their cars and made their way into the farmhouse. The door creaked open, and the sound of low voices drifted out into the night. Marcus moved quickly, his footsteps silent against the dirt. His heart rate stayed steady. He couldn't afford to let nerves get the best of him. Every move he made needed to be precise. Inside the farmhouse, the dim light revealed a round table where 3 men were seated. At the head of the table was Charles Bradford, the man Marcus had been hunting for years. He was older now, his face more worn, but the fire in his eyes was still sharp. Bradford was the mastermind behind it all. The operation. The people who had hunted Marcus. The reason his life had been shattered. Marcus wanted revenge, but he also wanted answers. Why had Bradford done this to him? What was his ultimate goal? Bradford glanced up from the papers in front of him, his eyes narrowing. The other 2 men, his right-hand operatives, were seated across from him, quietly waiting. "He's still out there," one of them said in a hushed tone. "We need to act fast before he comes for us." Bradford remained calm. He was never one to panic. "Let him come," he replied. "He's just one man. We've dealt with worse." But even as he spoke those words, Marcus knew Bradford was starting to feel the pressure. He was on edge, and that was when Marcus knew it was time to strike. The attack. Marcus positioned himself near a broken window on the far side of the farmhouse. He could hear their voices growing louder as they discussed their plans. Every word, every sentence they spoke fed his thirst for answers. But he needed to stay focused. This wasn't just about finding answers. It was about surviving. He moved quickly, silently, circling the farmhouse to get a better view of the back door. His instincts told him the door was the weak point in their defense. He could sneak in there, incapacitate the guards, and then confront Bradford. But he had to be careful. One wrong move, and he could end up in a firefight with men who wouldn't hesitate to kill him. He waited for the right moment. When he saw one of the men from inside step outside for a smoke break, Marcus knew it was his chance. He moved in quickly, taking the man out with a swift, precise move, rendering him unconscious without making a sound. The rest of the team inside had no idea what had just happened. Marcus was already inside the farmhouse, silently making his way toward the back room where Bradford and his men were talking. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. He was close now. The confrontation. Marcus stepped into the dimly lit room, the cold air from the open window hitting his face. He could hear Bradford and his men speaking in hushed tones, discussing their next steps. Bradford looked up when he heard the soft sound of footsteps, his eyes narrowing as he saw Marcus standing in the doorway. For a moment, there was silence. "Marcus," Bradford said, his voice calm but with an edge of surprise. "I didn't expect you to show up here. I thought you were a ghost by now." Marcus didn't respond. His eyes locked onto Bradford with cold determination. The weight of the years of pain, loss, and betrayal pressed down on him. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "Why?" Marcus finally asked, his voice low and steady. "Why did you do this to me? Why did you take everything from me?" Bradford's expression hardened. "You were always a liability, Marcus. You and your team, you were too good at what you did. We needed you out of the way. You were an obstacle to my vision. And now, here you are, still trying to ruin it all." Marcus's fingers tightened around the gun in his hand, but he didn't raise it. He was focused on Bradford, on making him pay for everything. "You underestimated me," Marcus said quietly. "And now you're going to pay for it." Before Bradford could react, Marcus moved. The fight was over in seconds. He had come too far to fail now. The aftermath. When it was over, Marcus stood in the center of the farmhouse, breathing heavily but with a sense of finality. Bradford was on the floor, unconscious. The men who had helped him were gone. The operation had been dismantled. But there was still a lingering emptiness in Marcus's chest. He had gotten his revenge, but it hadn't filled the void. He turned toward the door, knowing that his journey wasn't over. The police would soon arrive, and he had to disappear. But as he stepped outside, the first rays of the morning sun hit his face. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something other than anger or vengeance. There was a small sense of peace, knowing that the man who had caused him so much pain was finally out of the picture. Marcus wasn't done fighting, but for now he could rest.